the value of journal-entry. Next is the name attribute, so that whatever text is entered by the user, when it arrives at the server will know what this text relates to, in this case an entry. And as another reminder, the ID and name values can be whatever you want, and they can even be the same thing. But for now I'm keeping these values unique, so it's a bit clearer what they relate to. The last set of attributes are rows and cols. They set the visible dimensions in text characters. The row value is the number of lines the text will fit on, in this case 5 lines. And col is the number of characters the text will display horizontally, in this case 30 characters wide. Now you may be wondering, where is the type attribute we saw in the inputs chapter? We don't have a type attribute here because this is not an input, it is a text area. The type attribute is only used in inputs, like text, email, password, etc., to distinguish between those different types of inputs. The text area is just a text area. There are no other types, and it's defined on the tag itself. I'm then going to add a label of journal entry, and I have to give this a for attribute with the same value as ID, in this case journal-entry, and this will connect the label and text area. So in this chapter we learned about the text area tags. The text area tag had an ID, which was used to identify the element so that we can add a label. It had a name value, entry, which is used to identify the data when it eventually hits the server, so the server knows what data this relates to. And it had a rows and cols attribute, which defined the height and width of the text area in text characters. All of this makes up the text area element. We also added a label to this, which we called journal entry. And for the for attribute, the value had to match the value of the ID attribute, journal-entry. So this again was the label element. We now have 2 distinct blocks of code inside our form. The first block is a label and text area relating to a journal entry, and the second block is a label and input related to the journal title. Both of these are nested inside our form element. Let's now look at adding the text area to the Quill Create Journal page. We're using a text area over here for the journal entry. So let's go and add this in VS Code. So I'm inside the Create Journal HTML file. I'm going to pop down here and grab our text area tags by typing text, and you'll see straight away text area comes up. I'm going to hit enter to grab this. You'll notice that straight away we get all the attributes we need. I'm just going to reorder these slightly, as I like my ID attribute coming first. I'm going to give this text area the ID of journal entry. And as a reminder, this is used to identify the text area element so that we can add a label which connects to it. I'm going to give the name a value of entry. And as a reminder, this is used to identify the data that the user will eventually input into the text area, so that when it hits the server knows what the data the user inputted relates to. The cols has a predefined value of 30, which I'm going to leave, and I'm going to change the rows value to 5. I'm then going to add a label by hitting label and enter. We'll call this label journal entry, and the value of the for attribute needs to be the same as the value of the ID attribute. So I'm going to copy journal entry and paste it here. Let's check this out in the browser. You can see we now have our journal entry text area and the connected journal entry label. Now you'll notice that all these elements are appearing one next to each other horizontally, as opposed to vertically like some of the other elements we've seen throughout this section. We'll be discussing why this behavior is occurring later on in the HTML topic. But for now, I'm going to be doing something a bit hacky to clean this up, that you would never really do. I'm just going to put a line break tag between these 2 blocks of code. The line break is the BR tag, which we learnt about earlier on in this topic. I'm going to hit refresh in the browser to see what this does. So this now moves the journal entry label and text area below the journal title label and input. Using CSS is the proper way to implement the layout we want. You would never do this in real life. I've just done this for now because we don't know any CSS at this point. And later on, when we do cover CSS, I will come and remove this. Now, before we finish up, I want to quickly discuss why is the text area not a self-closing tag? The text area is not actually wrapping anything here. The reason is you can put starter text there. So for example, if I put the text, my day was, save this and refresh the browser, you'll see that text actually appears inside the text area. This is not to be confused with a placeholder, like we have in the input here, which says enter title. That's grayed out, and as soon as I click into this input, it disappears, and I enter my text. Whereas inside the text area, the text my day was will not be removed when I click into this. It's actual text inside the journal entry. Let's continue by learning how we can provide multiple options to users using dropdowns. We'll be discussing different form elements, what is a dropdown, and the select and option tags. So just a reminder on the different form elements. There are three main HTML elements that allow users to enter or select data in a form. We've seen inputs, and if you remember, there were a lot of these. In the previous chapter, we saw text area, and in this chapter, we will discuss the dropdown. So what is a dropdown? A dropdown allows users to choose from predefined options. On the Asana contact page, there are two dropdowns over here. One where you can select your country from a list, and another where you can select your company size from a list. So you can see the form here. If I go to country and click it, you'll see a predefined list appears. I have to select an option that's provided here. This is very different to the inputs we looked at earlier, where I, as the user, input the value. So let's take a look at how we code dropdowns in HTML with the select and option tags. In this example, we'll be coding the dropdown for our Quill Create Journal form. In the form, we allow users to select a category of the journal, like is this an idea, a reflection, a memory? These tags are going to wrap another set of tags, so we'll move them here for now. Let's go and add the attributes we need to the select opening tag. The first attribute we'll give it is the ID attribute with the value journal category. This then allows us to add a label, which has the same value journal category for the for attribute. As I'm sure you know by now, you have to have the same value for ID and for attributes to connect the label to the form element, in this case, a select tag. We next add the name attribute, and I'm going to give it the value of category. As a reminder, the purpose of the name attribute is that when the data eventually hits the server knows what this data relates to. Next up, we add our different options that appears on the drop-down menu. And this is done with option tags. We have an opening and closing option tag, which wraps the text of the option. In this case, task. We'll add another two options to our journal category. We'll add note and idea. Now, this is where things are a bit different to the other form elements we've seen so far. We need to give each option a value attribute, which in most cases will just be the same name as the text, just in lowercase. The value attribute sets the data that will be sent to the server. Because the user is not inputting any data, like in a text or email input, we need to provide a specific value, and just the text the option tags wrap is not good enough. We need to explicitly define the data the user selects as an HTML attribute with the value attribute. Now this can be a bit confusing, so to understand it a bit more, let's compare how dropdowns and inputs work. Taking a look at the dropdown first. When the user selects an option like task, it will be sent to the server like this. Category equals task. Category comes from the name attribute that's inside the select tag. And task is the predefined value we set with the value attribute inside the option tag. Let's compare this to the input form element. Let's say I created a new journal and gave it the title of Serenity. Title also comes from the name attribute that would be set inside the input tag. Now, Serenity is a user-entered value. It's what the user would have actually typed on their keyboard. So in a nutshell, Both the dropdown and input have names, like category and title, so that when the data hits the server knows what this data relates to. But the dropdown has a predefined value, explicitly set with the value attribute inside the option tags, whereas the value in, say, a text input is set by the user and is what they would type on their keyboard. Later on in this topic, we're going to look in depth at form submission and how data arrives at the server. So for now, if you can just recognize that on a dropdown, the developer sets the value, and for an input like a text or email, the user is setting the value by what they type, then you're doing great. So in this chapter, we learned about dropdowns. We started with the select tags that had an ID and name attribute. We added a label of journal category and made sure that the value of the for attribute matched the value of the ID attribute, in this case, journal-category. We then added option tags nested inside the select tags. Each option tag wraps some text that the user will see in the drop-down menu. Each option tag also has a value attribute that explicitly sets the value that the user chooses from the drop-down menu. We saw that this value attribute was not needed in other form elements like text or email inputs, because in those form elements, the user is defining the value by typing it in with their keyboard. So in summary, we've added a label element, a select element, and option elements, which are nested inside the select tags. So now looking at the different blocks of our form, we have the dropdown over here, the text area over here, and the text input over here. All of these form elements are nested inside the parent form tags. Let's now go add a dropdown to the Quill Create Journal page. On our Create Journal form, we have a dropdown over here, where the user can select the category of journal they are creating. So let's jump into VS Code and write this up. I'm in our createjournal.html file. I'm going to pop down below this line break tag, and I'm going to grab the select tag by typing select and hitting enter. I'm first going to hit enter to separate these tags, as we're soon going to put options here. I'm then going to swap the order of my ID and name, as that's just my preference. And I'll give this an ID value of journal category. Straight away, I'm going to grab my label element by typing label and hitting enter. We'll enter the text for the label journal category. And to connect our label to our select element, we need to give the for attribute the same value as the ID attribute. So I've just copied and pasted it. I'll give the name attribute a value of category. And just to keep hammering it home, this is used to identify the data when it hits the server. Let's now go and add our different options. Our application will have 8 options. So I'm going to do our nifty trick by typing option times 8 and hitting enter. For each option, I'm going to add the option text. The first option will be an idea, and I'll give it the same value in lowercase. The next one will be note, and I'll give it the same value in lowercase. To avoid boring you, I'm just going to go and complete this. So as you can see, I've added in the extra 6 options: goal, habit, memory, mood, event, and task, each with its respective value in lowercase. Now, the last thing I want to do is just add another line break tag here, so that we view this in the browser. Each form element block will appear below each other. And if you remember from the previous chapter, this is not something you'd ordinarily do. We just can't handle layout yet because we haven't learned CSS. So I will be removing these line break tags later on. Let's check this out in the browser. You can see it defaults to the first option, idea. And when I click the dropdown, I can select the others. Next, we'll learn how to actually submit forms using buttons. We'll be discussing what are buttons, the button tag, and the difference between buttons and hyperlinks. So what are buttons? Buttons trigger actions such as submitting a form. On the Asana form, you can see a submit button over here that once clicked will take all the user entered data to the server for processing. On the Unsplash homepage, this magnifying glass icon is also a button. Once the user enters the text for an image they want to find, they can click this button to tell the server to go and find all the related images. Let's now take a look at the button tag. there is the button opening tag, closing tag, and button text. The button can also have optional attributes. You will sometimes see a type attribute, such as type equals submit. This is actually just the default behavior, which is saying this button is used to submit a form and does not actually have to be included if the button is being used to submit a form, which is almost all cases. However, it is best practice to include this attribute. We've seen the type attribute already when we looked at input tags. We had to specify a type of input like text, email, or password. This is the same type attribute, but it has specific values for buttons, so you could not put type equals text, email, password here. The other type value you may see is reset, which is used to reset all the user entered data, so it essentially clears it from the form. Let's check out the button on the Asana form in DevTools. I'm going to right-click Inspect. I'm going to grab the Inspector tool and click on the button. You can see we have the button tags, and we have that type equals submit. As I said, you don't actually have to include it because the default behavior is to submit, but it is best practice, so we do include it. Now, a question you may have at this point is, what is the difference between buttons and hyperlinks? I mean, why didn't we just use the button tags when creating, say, the login or register hyperlinks before, as they also appear as buttons in the final project? Well, hyperlinks and buttons can appear visually the same, but serve different purposes. Let's look at the hyperlink element first. An example of a hyperlink we've made so far is the Get Started hyperlink. Hyperlinks are used to navigate users to a different page. In this case, when the user clicks on Get Started, they are taken to the registration page. Its sole purpose is to navigate users. Hyperlinks will often look like a button element, and we will in fact be styling this in the CSS section to make it look like a button. But don't be mistaken, behind the scenes in HTML, these are hyperlinks, not button elements. Let's now look at the button element. Looking at the example from this video where we created a button for our form called Submit. The button element is used to trigger actions like submit a form. They act within the current page. So for example, once the user submits the form, they could see a pop-up on the same page saying thank you. They're not necessarily taken anywhere new. The button is there just to trigger an action. However, a lot of times clicking a button can result in navigation to a different page. This is secondary and a byproduct of clicking a button. The main purpose of the button is to say submit form data. Once that is done, there could be extra logic to take users back to say all their journals once they have submitted the most recent one. In a nutshell, hyperlinks are used for page navigation, whereas buttons are used to trigger events happening on a page, and can sometimes also navigate users, which is a secondary effect. Let's take a look at hyperlinks and buttons behind the scenes in HTML on the completed Quill project. Now, all of these buttons are actually hyperlinks behind the scenes. They're just styled as buttons. And again, they're hyperlinks because their main purpose is to navigate users to another page. Let's take a look at this in DevTools. I'm going to inspect and click this login button. You can see that this is actually a hyperlink with anchor tags used. We're just using CSS to style them to look like buttons. Let's click on the login button and take a look at this submit button. You can see this is actually a button element. We're using button tags, not anchor tags. And that's because the main purpose of this button is to submit a form. It's triggering an action. And again, we just use CSS to style our buttons and hyperlinks to look the same. So let's finish off the summary card for this topic. The missing piece in this form is the button, which we saw was used to trigger an action like submitting a form. We discussed that it's best practice to add a type attribute with the value submit to submit a form. And another value we can use is reset, which clears the form fields. This is the button element. Taking a look at all our different blocks in the form. The first block is the text input for the journal title. The next block is the drop-down for the journal category. The next block is the text area where users enter their journal entry text. And the final block is the button used to submit the form. All of these elements are wrapped by the form tags. Let's now go ahead and add a button to the Quill Create Journal page. We have a Submit button in blue over here, which is used to submit the data in the form to the server. There is a Cancel button above this, which we will be handling later on in the React section of the course. The functionality here will be just to navigate users away from this page. So let's jump into VS Code and code this up. So I'm inside the Create Journal HTML file. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom here and add a button by typing button and hitting enter. We'll add button text of submit. I'm then going to add that type attribute and set it to submit. And if you recall, we don't actually need this because the default behavior of a button is to submit, but it is best practice to include it. Now again, I'm just going to add that line break tag so this appears on a separate line. So let's check this out in the browser. You can see that our submit button appears down the bottom here. Now in the next chapter, we're going to be spending quite a bit of time discussing how form submission actually works. But I do want to go ahead and submit the form now to show you some interesting behavior of the submit button. I'm going to just enter some random data for each of these elements. And you can see by clicking submit, the form submits. Now, the reason we're getting this error message is because we don't actually have a server set up. You can see in the address bar here, we're trying to submit the data to this section of the database, which doesn't exist, so we get this error message. But from HTML's perspective, the button is doing its job. It's submitting the form. What I want to show you is that the button element can actually live anywhere inside the form. It doesn't have to be at the bottom. For example, if I popped it right at the top, like this, I'm going to hit refresh. I'm going to go again and enter some data. And hit submit. It also submits the form. The button just has to be somewhere inside the form. As soon as the button moves outside the form, it won't work. So for example, I'm going to grab our button and just get rid of this line break tag. And I'm going to put the button outside the form over here. I'm going to go enter some random data. And I'm going to hit submit. And you can see it does absolutely nothing. The button has to be somewhere inside the form in order for it to trigger the form submission. Let's pop it back where it should be. I also want to show you don't need this attribute. So if I just cut this for now, refresh, add some random data, and hit submit, the form still submits. And that's because the default behavior of the button is to have type submit there. But as I've mentioned, we have it there for best practice. The final thing I want to show you is the reset attribute value. If I change this to reset, enter some random data, and hit submit, you'll see that it clears the form. That's the behavior of setting type equals reset. I'm just going to change it back to submit. Now we'll take a look at how to send user data to a server by focusing on form submission. We'll be discussing how form data is packaged and sent to the server, and the HTTP request and response when submitting data. So in this chapter, I'm going to be doing a detailed walkthrough of form submission. As we know by now, forms need to know where to and how to send data. I'm going to recap the library analogy we've been using in the last few chapters, as I just want to make sure we're on the same page in conceptually understanding how forms are submitted. We're going to be looking at the case where you donate a book. The book is given to the librarian, and the librarian then adds the book to the appropriate shelf. Now, there are three important aspects of this interaction we need to look at. So the first aspect is how I'm interacting with the librarian. In this case, I'm donating a book. It's the how I'm interacting. Now, as we've seen before, there are other kinds of interactions you can have, like borrowing a book. The second aspect is where the book is eventually being stored. In this case, it's the history shelf. But of course, depending on the book, it could go to other shelves. Say if it was a science fiction book or a children's book. This is the where. The third aspect is about what I'm actually donating. In this case, it's a book. But libraries have other kinds of resources, like old school movies available on DVD. So this is the what. So let's now look at this library interaction through the eyes of HTML forms. We'll first look at the what, and for HTML forms, this is the data. For our library analogy, it could look something like this. Type equals book, which is defining what resource this is, in this case a book, and name equals mouse, which would be the title of the book. For the how, this is the method attribute. It's how we're interacting with the server. In this case, it's post, because the book is being added to the shelf. It's the same as a new record being created on a database. And finally, the where is the action attribute. In this case, it could be action/history. It's the location in the library the book is being stored. And as I mentioned before, because this is a history book, it's going in the history shelf in the library. But if it was another category of book, like science, the action attribute would be something like /science. So this is the form we've been working on where users can submit a new journal entry. So let's now identify the where, how, and what. The action attribute inside the form tag is the where. It's the location on the server the journal entry will be sent to. In this case, it's /API/v1/journals. And just like the library where there's different shelves for different books, on our database, there would be different locations for different kinds of data. So for example, a web application is going to have user data. So user data would be stored in a location like /API/v1/users. Don't worry so much about the /API/v1 for now. It's just web development stuff we're going to talk about later. The second attribute in the form tag, method equals post, is the how. It's how we're interacting with the server and database. In this case, because we're submitting a new journal entry, we're creating a new record on the database, so it's appropriate to use method equals post, just like you donate a book. Now, as I've mentioned in previous chapters, there are other methods like get, put, and delete. And I'm going to be talking about the get method a bit later on. The final aspect is the actual data itself. It's the what. These form elements include a text input, a dropdown, and a text area. And it's where the user will be entering data and selecting data that's packaged up and then sent to the server. I'm now going to step you through exactly what happens when a user inputs data and submits a form. The first element we have in our Create Journal form is a text input for the journal title. And here is the HTML input element. We gave the input a name attribute with the value title. As a reminder, the name attribute is what is used to identify the data that is being submitted to the server, so the server knows what this data relates to. Let's take out title, as this is going to be sent to the server. Let's say a user typed in this input car washing as an idea for a business. This is the value that is sent to the server. So let's also take this out and put it over here. So when the form is submitted, the data is sent like this. Title equals car washing. If the user entered something else like scuba diving, we would have title equals scuba diving. The second element we had in our form was a dropdown, where the user selected the category of the journal. And here was the corresponding HTML. We also gave the dropdown a name attribute inside the select tag with the value of category. And again, this is the identifier that will be sent to the server. So let's take it out and put it over here. Let's say the user selects idea from the dropdown. This is a predefined value that's set with the value attribute inside the option element. So this is the value that will be sent to the server. So let's pop it over here. So when the form is submitted, the data that is sent looks like this. Category equals idea. If the user selected another category like task, then it would be category equals task. The final form element we had was a text area, where users enter their journal entry. The corresponding HTML looked like this. We gave the text area a name value of entry, which again is the identifier that will be sent to the server. So let's take it out and put it over here. Let's say the user enters the text of a car wash that serves coffee while you wait. This is the value that is sent to the server. So let's also take this out and put it over here. So this is what will be sent to the server. Entry equals a car wash that serves coffee while you wait. And if the user entered anything else like a car wash that serves tea while you wait, that would be the value that is sent. So in summary, we have this. For the journal title text input, we have title equals car washing. For the journal category dropdown, we have category equals idea. And for the journal text area, we have entry equals a car wash that serves coffee while you wait. This is the package of data that is sent to the server. Let's look at this visually now. We have our user, our server, like the librarian, and our database, like the bookshelf. The user will fill out the form and sends the data. The data is what we just saw. Title equals car washing, category equals idea, and entry equals a car wash that serves coffee while you wait. This will hit the server, and the server sends the data to the correct part of the database to create a record. This is the method. It's how we are interacting with the server. In this case, method equals post. We are adding new data to the database, just like we added a new book to the shelf when we donated it. The final piece is the action, which is the exact location on the server where the journal data will be saved. In this case, it's /API/v1/journals. It is here the journal is created. So let's go ahead and submit some form data and take a look what's happening behind the scenes. So I'm going to go ahead and submit some data. For the title, I'm going to use car washing. The category, I'm going to select as idea. And for the text, a car wash that serves coffee while you wait. So I'm now going to go submit this. Now, as I mentioned in the previous chapter, we're getting an error because we don't actually have a server set up. We can see that the data is trying to be sent to /API/v1/journals. However, the HTML form is working. From its perspective, it has successfully sent the data. I'm going to go do this again, but I want to look in DevTools at the Network tab. I'm going to go Inspect and tap Network. Network is responsible for showing network requests, like sending data to a server. We'll be talking about this a lot more in a later topic in the Full Stack Bootcamp. I'm going to hit Submit, and as you saw before, the form fails because we have no server. If I click on this first row over here, Journals, this now is the HTTP request and response for sending the data we have entered to the server to try create a record in the database. You can see we have the request URL here. This is what we defined in the method attribute in the form. If I head over to Payload, you can see we have the name and values, title car washing, category idea, entry a car wash that serves coffee while you wait. So this is the package of data that is sent to the server. You can see now why that name attribute is so important. It's giving a name to the data that the user is entering or selecting. Now, because we don't actually have a server set up, we are getting no response. I now want to go do the same thing, but on our completed project, to show you what this would look like in real life. We'll enter the same data, car washing, the journal type, we'll select idea, and for the entry, a car wash that serves coffee while you wait. I'm now going to open up the DevTools, head over to Network, and submit the form. I'm just going to scroll this up slightly. I'm going to click on this first row over here. On the headers, you can see that same request URL, /API/v1/journals. This is the location on the database we're creating that journal record. We can also now see a request method, post, which we defined in the HTML form as method equals post. We're also now getting back a status code, 201 created. This means that the journal has been successfully created as a new record in the database. We'll be talking about status codes a lot more in a later topic in the Full Stack Bootcamp. If I head over to Payload, you can see the data that's being sent. We have our title, our entry, and our category. I've just called it type on the final application. We called it category. It doesn't really matter. I'm also automatically sending an emoji for the type of journal, in this case, a light bulb. We'll be adding that functionality later on in the React section. If I now go to response, this is data we are getting back from the server. This is essentially the record that is being created in the database, and I'm sending it back to the front end so that we can then display this journal. I'm getting back a few other things that are specific to the database, like when it was created, a unique ID for this journal, and which user it was created by. Again, this is stuff we'll discuss much later on in the course. For now, I want you to see that we did get a response back. So before we finish up, I do want to look at form submission for the other type of interaction that we've seen in the last few chapters. So instead of donating a book, we're now going to go and borrow a book. In this case, we would ask the librarian for a book, and the librarian looks for the book on the shelf. If the book exists, they would take the book from the shelf and hand it to us. So let's go through the what, how, and where. For the what, it's still a book. And let's say we are asking for the book Mouse. So the what here doesn't change. Of course, it could be anything though. We could be looking for a type movie and a name Unbroken. For the how, this is no longer a post method. In the donating book case, we were adding a book to the library, creating something that didn't exist there before. In this case, we're just retrieving something already on the library. So the method here is get. Now don't worry so much about HTTP methods, we will be talking about them at great length later in the course. And finally, the where, the location of the book in the library. This is the action attribute /history. And because we're still looking for a history book, the value of the action attribute /history is still the same. But of course, this could be another shelf, depending on what we were requesting. If I were wanting to borrow a science book, the librarian would go to the science shelf. So the action here would be /science. I'm going to go and quickly make an HTML form to show you how this looks behind the scenes. Inside VS Code, I'm going to hit New File, click Text File, select a language, and search for HTML. I'm going to grab our boilerplate code straight away by hitting !Enter. I'm going to save this on our desktop and just call it form.html. Let's give it a title of form. I'm going to be making a quick form where a user will be able to search for different journals based on a title and/or category. I'll first get our form element by typing form and hitting enter. For the action value, this is where we're searching on the database. And because we're searching for journals, it lives in the same location. /API, /v1, /journals. I'm then going to go add our method attribute. And now because we're trying to retrieve values, the correct method is get. Post was used for creating a new record on the database. I'm now going to go get an input element by typing input and hitting enter. This input element is going to be the search area where users will search for a journal title. I'm going to give this a name of search. I'm going to give this input an ID of search bar. And then I'm going to add a label called search. And the for value needs to be the same as the ID value so that the label is connected to the input. I'm also just going to add some placeholder text of search journal. Next up, I'm going to add a dropdown where users can select a category of journal. I'm going to get the select tag by typing select and hitting enter. I'm going to swap the order of the ID, that's just my preference. I'll give this a name value of category and an ID of journal category. I'll grab the label and give it the text journal category and copy the ID value and paste it as the for value to connect the select to the label. I'll then add a few options. I'm just going to add 3 for this example: idea, task, and memory. And I'm going to give the value attribute those same names, just lowercase. Finally, I'll add a button so we can submit the form. I'll give it the text submit. And for best practice, I'm going to add a type with the value submit. So let's go check this out in the browser and submit this form and see what happens behind the scenes. Let's pretend I have thousands of journal entries, and a few of them will contain the title Love. So I'm going to be searching for journals that contain the title Love. But let's say I only want journals with the title Love that belong to memory. Before I submit this, I'm just going to open up DevTools on the Network tab so we can see what's happening behind the scenes. I'm going to hit Submit. I'm going to go to this first row over here. Now, you'll notice that the request is structured slightly differently to the POST request. The request URL is /API/v1/journals. But now we have this question mark with search equals love and category equals memory. This is called a query string and is positioned after the request URL with a question mark. If we head over to payload, you can see that these are now query string parameters, with search as love and category as memory. For the POST request, this was not called query string parameters. It was called a request payload. Now, there's a lot of terms flying around here. I really don't want you worrying about them. For now, I just want you to understand that GET and POST requests are structured quite differently. When I was making this video, I was weighing up whether I should even include the GET method example. But I thought for the sake of completeness, for the two library analogies we've been looking at, it was worth showing you. For now, I wouldn't worry too much about understanding all the details of form submission, like payloads, query strings, etc. It's a complex topic, and we'll be covering it in a lot more detail later on in the Full Stack Bootcamp. For now, if you could conceptually understand the idea that in HTML forms we are sending name data, the what, to a specific location on the database, the where, and that the how is about how the data is processed or how we are interacting with the server. It can be a POST, where we will create a new record on the database, in the library analogy, donating a book, or it can be a GET, where we retrieve relevant data from the database, in the library analogy, borrowing a book. If you can conceptually understand this at this point, you're doing great. Moving forward, we'll cover how to ensure data accuracy and completeness through form validation. We'll be talking about what is validation, client and server-side validation, and built-in versus custom validation. So, what is validation? Validation is the process of checking data to ensure it meets expected criteria. On the Unsplash registration form, we have an email input that expects the user to enter a value that is in email format, something like daniel@gmail.com. In the password input, you can see it requires a minimum of 8 characters, so there is an expected password length. So let's see this in action. I'm going to add my first name and my last name, and then I'm just going to enter some random text not in email format in the email field. If I try click join, you'll see we get this message, please include an @ in the email address. So this is validation. The email field is expecting an @ symbol, and the form isn't submitting until I enter the email in the correct format. I'm going to enter it in the correct format now. I'll just do daniel@gmail.com. And for the username, I'll do danbrand200. Now for the password, I'm going to enter a password with less than 8 characters, just 1, 2, 3. If I try click join, you'll see we get another validation message. Please lengthen this text to 8 characters or more. So again, this is validation in action. We're not meeting the expected criteria of what the form wants. Let's now discuss the difference between client and server-side validation. We'll look again at the library analogy. Let's say we want to donate a book. Before we arrive at the library, we'd want to check on our bookshelf, is this the correct book we're taking? We also may want to check, is it in a suitable condition, by checking, are all the pages there? This is client-side validation. It's checks that we do before we interact with the librarian. When the book arrives at the librarian will check for similar things, like, is this the correct book? Are all the pages there? And could also do additional checks that the person donating the book couldn't do, like, is this book already on the shelf, and do we need it? These checks the librarian is conducting are called server-side validation. They are checks done by the librarian before adding the book to the shelf. Once the checks are complete, the librarian will add the book to the shelf. Let's now look at this in terms of web development. We have our user on the front end who sends data in the HTML form. Let's say they are wanting to register a new account and need to enter an email address. Before the data is sent, the form on the front end will check things like, is this a valid email address, which we saw earlier on the Unsplash registration page. This is client-side validation. When the data arrives at the server will also do its own checks. Some are similar, like, is this a valid email? Just a double check. But some would be checks only the server could do because it has access to the database. A check like, is this email unique? That is, does the email already exist in our database? Because if it did, we'd have to reject this request. This is all server-side validation. Once the server has done all its checks, it will then create a record in the database of the new user's details. I want to now look in more detail at client-side validation, as there are actually two types. The first type of client-side validation is built-in validation. This is validation that is automatically provided by the browser for certain input types. For example, the email input type will automatically check that the value the user enters is in a correct email format. And again, this is what we saw on the Unsplash registration page, where that message popped up when we didn't enter the email in the correct format. The number type will check that numbers are entered and not letters. There's no extra work we need to do to get these validations. They're built in as part of the input type. The second type of client-side validation is custom validation. This is validation set by a developer using HTML attributes. For example, for our journal title text input on our Quill application, we can add a required attribute that checks that the user does enter a value for the title. That is, the user could not submit the form without giving their journal a title. Some other common validation attributes are min length and max length, which is used to set the minimum and maximum length of characters, and could be used for something like the title of a journal. We might want the journal title to be a minimum length and not go over a maximum length. Other validation attributes include min and max, which are used for numbers. For example, you could use the min attribute for a minimum age to buy alcohol online. Or you could use max value to limit the number of nights you can book a hotel room for online. These attributes all have a value that you would set. There are also some validation attributes like required, which we spoke about before, that has no value. Now, before we finish up, something I want to show you is that most modern web applications actually have JavaScript handling validation, something we'll be doing later on in the Full Stack Bootcamp. I'm on the Descript sign-in page. Descript is a video editing tool. If I go to the Dev Tools, right-click Inspect, and I inspect the password field, you'll see that there's no validation here. I specifically want to show you that there's no required attribute. However, when I fill out the form and leave off the password and try submit it, you'll see password can't be blank. You'll also notice that the styling is a bit different. We get a red border, and the text isn't appearing in that pop-up box. It's appearing below in red. This validation is being handled by JavaScript, and it's a more modern and clean implementation. The reason I wanted to show you this is that you may go around in DevTools checking out different forms and seeing that there is no validation, but validation is happening. So I just wanted to highlight that most modern web applications will be using JavaScript to handle validation, not relying on the HTML built-in validation or custom validation. The most important thing you get from this video is the concept of validation. Let's now go and add some custom validation to the Quill Create Journal page. Let's add a minimum length and require to our title. We'll add a require to the journal category, and we'll also add a minimum length and require to the journal entry. Let's jump into VS Code and write this up. Alright, so I'm in our Create Journal HTML file. Inside the input, I'm going to first add the min length attribute, and let's make this 3 characters. I'll then add the required attribute, which ensures users have to enter a value for the journal title. For the journal category, I'm just going to add the required attribute, And then for the text area, I'm going to add a min length again. Let's make this 10 characters and a required. So let's check this out in the browser. So first up, I'm just going to hit submit with no values entered. And you can see straight away it's telling us to fill in this field. I'm just going to enter one character, A. Let's hit submit and see what happens. It says, please lengthen this text to 3 characters. So we can see that our min length is working. Let's call this journal Fun Day. Now, the journal category actually already defaults to a value, so I can't really test this to show you that it will fail. If I hit submit now, you'll see that the journal entry is now giving us an error, please fill in this field, because we set it as required. I'm going to enter 5 characters, A, B, C, D, E, and hit submit. And you'll see it says, please lengthen this text to 10 characters, because that was the min length we set over here. I'm going to enter more than 10 characters, and because we're meeting all validation criteria, the form will submit. Now, just a small note on this. The particular form elements I have here of a text input, dropdown, and text area don't actually have any built-in validation. If we had, for example, an email input, that does have built-in validation. What we've done is just code up some custom validation. Now, of course, you can have both built-in and custom validation. For example, in an email input that comes with built-in validation to check the email format is correct. And you could also make that required, which is custom validation. Finally, we'll explore how to let users select options by using checkbox and radio buttons. We'll be discussing checkbox and radio types and comparing checkbox and radio. So let's take a look again at the different input types that exist. We've seen textual inputs where users enter text like password, email, or numbers. We have binary input types, like a checkbox and radio button. We'll be covering these in this chapter. There is a file input that allows users to upload files. And then there is a whole bunch of miscellaneous inputs, like a range or color picker. Now, in our Quill project, we're only using textual inputs, but I thought it would be a good idea to still cover binary inputs, the checkbox and radio buttons, as they are still commonly used. The other input types, file input and miscellaneous, are just not as commonly used. And we would be here a long time if we went through every single one, and we do have more important material to focus on. Let's start by looking at the checkbox. A checkbox allows users to select one or more options from a predefined list. Here is an example of a self-employment tax calculator, where as a user you can input different information, like annual income, tax codes, etc. And the tool will calculate your tax and take-home income in daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly amounts. One of the criteria it asks for is if you are married, blind, or have no national insurance contribution. As you can see, checkboxes allow you to select one or more options from the list. Let's now take a look at the checkbox type in HTML. In this example, I'm going to be making a form where users can select different pizza toppings with checkboxes. We start with an input tag. I'm going to go straight away and add a label tag that will be for the pineapple topping. And I've given it a for attribute of topping 1. Now you'll notice that for checkboxes, the label will often appear after the input, so that in the browser, the order will be checkbox followed by the label. You can, of course, put your label first, but this ordering is more common. Inside the input, let's add our attributes. The first will be the ID attribute, with the value of topping 1. So our input and label are now connected. The next is the type attribute, which we set to checkbox. This specifies the checkbox type. And if you remember from other inputs, we had types like email and password. The next attribute is the name attribute, which I've given the value of pineapple. We need the name attribute so when the data hits the server knows what this data relates to. Next up, I'm going to add another 2 checkboxes in this exact format for corn and olives. And you can of course add as many as you want. I want you to take note that each checkbox input has a unique name. This is very important, and we'll see now why when we go code this up. All right, so we're in VS Code now. I've just made a random file called binaryinputs.html. The markup you see is just what we saw before. I'm going to now make this into a form by adding the form tags and having them wrap our input and labels. If you remember, the action attribute is the location on the database the data will be sent to. Let's just call this food/pizza. This could be a restaurant that serves other food, like pasta and burgers. So that data would be sent to /food/burgers or /pasta. We'll add our method attribute. In this case, because we're going to be creating a new record on the database, it's a post method. Final thing I need to do is add a button so that we can submit our form. I'll put the text submit inside the button. And for best practice, we know it's good to add a type equals submit. All right, let's check this out in the browser. So you'll see all different checkboxes up here. First thing you'll notice is that the labels appear on the right of the checkbox. This is because we put the label after the input. And if we put it the other way around, the label would appear on the left. The next thing you'll notice is I can select multiple options, not just one. And I can in fact select them all if I want. This is the nature of a checkbox. You can select one or more values. I'm going to select pineapple and corn. And let's now take a look in DevTools as we submit this request. I'm going to right-click Inspect and head to the Network tab. Let's submit. And as you're aware by now, the form has submitted. We just get this error message because there is no server to receive our data. In the Network tab, I'm going to click on this row. And you can see under Payload, we have pineapple on and corn on. Those are the two checkboxes I selected. You'll also notice olives is just absent. This is why it is a binary input. It's either on or off. It's also why I mentioned each name has to be unique, pineapple, corn, and olives. Because if they're selected, that name is sent to the server, like we see here, pineapple and corn, and it's automatically just given a value of on to say that it was selected. Let's now take a look at the radio button. Radio buttons allow users to select exactly one option from a predefined list. Looking back at the tax calculator, for the ages section, radio buttons are used, as the person filling out this form can only fit into one of these categories, under 75, 75 to 84, or over 84. So it makes sense to use a radio button. You can only select one option. Let's now take a look at the radio type in HTML. In this example, I'm going to be making a form where users select their shirt size, like you would see on an e-commerce website. We start with the input tag. I'll straight away go and add a label tag that will be for the small size, and give it a for attribute with the value of small. Like with checkboxes, the label will also often appear after the input, so that in the browser, the order will be radio button followed by the label. Inside the input, let's add our attributes. The first will be the ID attribute with the value of small, so that we can connect our input to label. The next is the type attribute with value radio. This specifies that this is a radio type, just like we had before type equals checkbox, or for text inputs, things like type equals email or type equals password. We then give the radio button a name attribute, which I've called size, so that when this data hits the server knows what this relates to. We then also have to give our radio input a value attribute, which I've called S for small. Now, this is different to the checkbox type. We didn't need a specific value there, but we do for the radio button. To explain why, let's go and add another two radio buttons. One for a medium shirt and one for a large shirt. Now, what I want you to notice is that the name value for each of these inputs is the same. Name equals size. Now, the reason we have the same value is because we're only going to be submitting one of these, because in a radio type, you can only select one option. And because the name value is the same for all of them, the value attribute is needed to distinguish between the options. This all may sound a bit confusing right now, but it will become clearer soon when we look at this in the browser, and I will also be doing a side-by-side comparison of checkbox and radio buttons, so just stick with me. Now, before we look at that, I do want to do a quick value attribute reminder, as it can be a bit confusing what this actually is. Let's look at the text input, like say the title of a journal. Over here, title is the name we set on the text input, as name equals title. And car wash business is the user entered value. It's what the user actually typed in the input box in the browser on their keyboard. Comparing this now to the radio input. We also have the name, which we defined with the name attribute, name equals size, but the value small is a predefined value. The user is not entering any text on their keyboard. They are simply selecting the small option, which has a predefined value of S, so that when it is sent to the server, it is sent as size equals S. If you also remember, we used predefined values on option elements inside drop-down menus. So let's jump into VS Code. So I've got the code we saw before. Let's go and make this an actual form by adding in the form tags and having them wrap these inputs and labels. As you'll recall, the action attribute is the location on the database we're sending this data. I'm just going to make it /clothing/shirts. I'm then also going to add a method of post, as this data will be sent to a server and a new record would be created for the order of this particular shirt. I'll finish up the form by adding a button so that we can submit it. And for best practice, I'm going to add type equals submit. Let's check this out in the browser. So you can see, like our checkboxes, we now have radio buttons with the labels on the right. And you'll notice I can only click one of them. As soon as I click another option, it immediately removes it from the previous location. This is the nature of a radio button. You can only select one option. Before we submit the form, I want to open up DevTools so we can see the HTTP request. I'm going to select large and hit submit. I'm then going to click on this row over here and look at the payload tab. And you can see we have size L. Only one piece of data is being submitted. And that is why we had to explicitly define a value, because the size of the shirt could be any one of these values. Because size is used 3 times for small, medium, and large. So in order to distinguish these, we had to provide a value. There's no on-off like we saw in the checkbox. Before we finish up, I want to do a detailed side-by-side comparison of checkbox versus radio buttons to help clarify their differences, as I know it can be confusing to properly appreciate the differences between them. Looking at the checkbox first. The checkbox form we built was for a list of pizza toppings: pineapple, corn, and olives. If you can recall, we gave each checkbox a unique name. We do this for checkboxes because the user can choose one or more options. This means one or more options can be submitted, so each option has a unique name. We saw when we submitted it in DevTools, we just had the value on when we tick the checkbox. For checkboxes, the value attribute is not needed, as each input has a unique name and is either on or off. Now looking at radio buttons, the form we built with radio buttons was a list of shirt sizes: small, medium, and large. If you can recall, each radio button has the same name, size, and also a unique value: S for small, M for medium, and L for large. We do this for radio buttons because the user can only choose one value from the options. This means only one option can be submitted, so each option has the same name. In DevTools, we saw this, where we selected large, and the payload sent to the server was size equals L. For radio buttons, the value attribute is needed, as each input has the same name. There's no on-off, like in checkbox. We need a value there to distinguish between the different options. Alright, I know that was a lot to take in, but we've now completed the HTML form section of the course. The next topic is containers and semantic HTML, where we'll start by discussing the important concept of block and inline elements, and we'll then move on to look at the generic container elements, div and span, and finish off the topic by exploring semantic HTML, which are critical for proper HTML document structure. Let's start by distinguishing between 2 fundamental types of HTML elements, known as block and inline elements. We'll be talking about block and inline elements, and nesting block and inline elements. So what are block and inline elements? All HTML elements are by default either a block or inline element. First, let's look at block elements. Block elements always start on a new line. I'm going to represent them like this. They start on a new line because they take up the full width of a page. Some examples of block elements that we've seen so far are headings, paragraphs,